Avoidant individuals do not usually chase love itself. More often, they become deeply affected when an experience challenges the emotional certainty they have built around themselves. Affection, reassurance, and long emotional explanations rarely create lasting change on their own. In many cases, they simply fit into a pattern they already understand. What often captures their attention is something very different. It is an unexpected shift that challenges their assumptions, not emotional chaos but psychological surprise. The moment someone calmly steps out of the role they expected can have a far greater impact than countless attempts to convince them to care. This is not because love suddenly becomes stronger, it is because certainty has been interrupted. Stay with me, because this is where the dynamic becomes much more interesting. Many avoidant people rely on emotional distance as a way of feeling safe. They often manage closeness by predicting how others will respond, maintaining familiar patterns, and keeping enough emotional space to avoid feeling overwhelmed. But when those familiar patterns quietly disappear, something changes. They begin noticing what no longer fits their expectations. It is not necessarily love at first, it is awareness. Awareness that they may have misunderstood someone. Awareness that the other person is more emotionally independent than they assumed. Awareness that the relationship is no longer following the script they quietly depended on. That realization can become difficult to ignore because it introduces uncertainty into a system that once felt predictable. People who quietly leave with dignity, without arguments, endless explanations, or emotional chasing, often create a stronger impression than those who fight for attention. Calm confidence speaks in ways words sometimes cannot. When someone chooses self-respect over emotional pursuit, they introduce a new reality the avoidant person did not prepare for. Instead of trying to pull them back through emotional pressure, they simply continue living their own life. That quiet change becomes impossible to categorize. For someone accustomed to emotional predictability, uncertainty becomes far more noticeable than reassurance ever was. The attention shifts inward. They begin replaying conversations, wondering whether they misunderstood the situation. They revisit moments that once seemed insignificant. They notice an absence they expected to remain available. This does not always mean they have suddenly become emotionally secure or ready for a healthy relationship. It simply means something challenged the emotional structure they depended on. That challenge often becomes difficult to forget because it forces reflection instead of avoidance. The strongest impression rarely comes from trying harder. It often comes from quietly becoming someone they no longer fully understand. If you want to understand why some avoidant people seem to become more interested after someone walks away, it helps to understand what they often value most beneath the surface. It is not necessarily emotional distance itself. It is the sense of control that distance provides. Many avoidant individuals feel safest when they believe they can manage the pace of closeness, decide when vulnerability feels acceptable, and maintain enough emotional space to avoid feeling overwhelmed. Their relationship patterns are frequently built around staying one step ahead emotionally. This is why emotional pressure often pushes them farther away instead of bringing them closer. However, when someone calmly steps outside that familiar pattern, something changes. The person they expected to remain emotionally available is suddenly focused on their own life. There is no dramatic goodbye, no emotional pursuit, no attempt to force clarity, just quiet confidence. That shift interrupts expectations in a way that arguments rarely can. Predictability disappears, and uncertainty quietly takes its place. For someone who depends on emotional certainty, that uncertainty can become surprisingly powerful. They begin questioning assumptions they never examined before. They may wonder whether they misunderstood the connection or whether they underestimated the other person's independence. Instead of controlling the rhythm of the relationship, they are suddenly responding to changes they did not anticipate. That change can create reflection where emotional pressure never could. It is important to remember that this is not about manipulating someone into caring. It is about refusing to participate in unhealthy patterns. Choosing self-respect over emotional chasing changes the dynamic because it removes the familiar script. Calm detachment is not punishment, it is clarity. It communicates that your peace no longer depends on someone else's inconsistency. That quiet confidence often speaks louder than emotional explanations because it cannot easily be dismissed or predicted. Keep watching, because the next part explains why genuine confidence has such a lasting impact. The deeper truth is that healthy relationships are never built by trying to interrupt another person's emotional control. They are built when both people become emotionally responsible for themselves. Someone who continues growing, healing, pursuing meaningful goals, and finding fulfillment beyond the relationship naturally becomes more attractive because they radiate emotional stability rather than emotional dependence. They no longer need constant reassurance, endless explanations, or external validation to feel complete. That inner balance changes every interaction. Their calm presence quietly communicates confidence without demanding attention. Instead of reacting to mixed signals, they respond with clarity. Instead of chasing uncertainty, they choose consistency. Instead of trying to convince someone of their value, they simply continue living according to it. Ironically, this is often the moment others begin noticing them more deeply. Not because they became unavailable as a strategy, but because they became genuinely secure within themselves. Whether an avoidant person returns or not, this transformation always benefits the individual making it. It protects emotional well-being, strengthens self-respect, and creates space for healthier relationships in the future. The goal is never to make someone obsessed. The goal is to become so grounded in your own life that your happiness no longer depends on another person's fears, avoidance, or uncertainty. If someone chooses to move closer, it should come from mutual honesty, emotional maturity, and shared effort rather than confusion or wounded pride. In the end, the strongest position is never one of emotional control. It is emotional freedom. Continue investing in your own growth, protect your peace, and allow every future relationship to be built on trust, consistency, and genuine choice. That kind of connection lasts because it is rooted in respect instead of uncertainty, and in authenticity instead of emotional games. Avoidant people often seem comfortable with emotional distance, but what can unsettle them most is not dramatic confrontation. It is realizing that someone has quietly stopped revolving around their emotional rhythm. The moment you begin living according to your own pace instead of constantly responding to theirs, the dynamic changes. Suddenly, they are no longer certain where they stand. Many avoidant individuals spend less time analyzing emotions themselves and more time observing patterns of behavior. They notice consistency, changes in routine, and unexpected shifts. When your behavior no longer matches the version of you they had grown accustomed to, you become difficult to predict. That uncertainty naturally captures attention because familiar patterns have disappeared. Instead of knowing exactly how you will respond, they are left wondering what changed. Stay with me, because this quiet shift often has a greater impact than endless emotional conversations ever could. When someone calmly steps away from unhealthy dynamics without anger, revenge, or emotional chasing, they create space for reflection. The avoidant person may replay previous conversations, revisit old memories, or think about interactions that once seemed ordinary. They may notice your absence in ways they never noticed your constant presence. This does not automatically mean they have become emotionally available or ready for a healthy relationship. It simply means the familiar emotional pattern has been interrupted. People often pay closer attention when something no longer behaves the way they expected. Your calm confidence becomes something they cannot easily explain. The emotional role they quietly assign to you no longer exists. Instead of reacting to silence with anxiety, you continue building your own life. Instead of seeking reassurance, you remain grounded in your own direction. That quiet independence creates a different kind of impression because it reflects genuine self-respect rather than emotional dependence. The greatest change is not that you became unavailable. The greatest change is that you stop defining yourself through someone else's emotional inconsistency. When your life begins revolving around your own growth instead of another person's uncertainty, you become someone who is much harder to fit into old expectations. That quiet transformation often speaks louder than anything you could have said. Many avoidant individuals develop relationship habits that help them manage emotional discomfort. Sometimes they create distance when closeness feels overwhelming. Sometimes they become inconsistent while trying to protect themselves from vulnerability. Other people often respond by chasing, over-explaining, or trying harder to restore connection. Those reactions can unintentionally keep the same unhealthy cycle alive. But when someone responds differently, with calmness, emotional balance, and healthy boundaries, the familiar pattern begins to change. Instead of reacting automatically, they simply continue living according to their own values. They no longer rush to explain themselves, decode every mixed signal, or seek constant reassurance. This creates something unfamiliar. Predictability disappears. The avoidant person may begin wondering why the usual pattern is no longer happening. Rather than controlling the rhythm of the relationship, they find themselves responding to changes they did not expect. What captures attention is not emotional withdrawal itself, but emotional stability. Someone who remains peaceful without becoming cold, who respects themselves without becoming defensive, and who chooses consistency over emotional games becomes difficult to categorize. They are no longer participating in the push and pull dynamic. Instead, they quietly step outside of it altogether. That shift often encourages reflection because it removes the emotional reactions that once made the cycle predictable. The important lesson here is not about becoming mysterious as a strategy. It is about becoming emotionally healthy enough that your reactions are no longer driven by fear. When you stop trying to manage another person's emotions and begin managing your own, you naturally become calmer, more confident, and more authentic. That authenticity cannot be manipulated because it does not depend on someone else's approval. Keep listening, because this final idea changes the entire perspective. Silence, when it comes from peace rather than punishment, can be incredibly powerful. It is not the silent treatment. It is not an attempt to manipulate or provoke guilt. It is simply the decision to stop chasing answers from someone who is unwilling or unable to give them. Healthy silence creates space for both people to face their own emotions without constant distraction. For someone who often relies on emotional distance as protection, that space can become uncomfortable because there is no longer another person's reactions to focus on. Instead, they are left with their own thoughts. They may begin recognizing what the relationship meant, noticing what has changed, or questioning assumptions they previously never examined. Whether they grow from that experience depends entirely on their own willingness to do the inner work. Your responsibility is not to create that transformation. Your responsibility is to protect your own peace. The strongest position you can ever reach is realizing that your happiness no longer depends on whether someone chooses to move closer or farther away. You continue healing, learning, pursuing meaningful goals, and building a life that feels complete on its own. If someone returns, let it be because they have developed the emotional maturity to build something healthy, not because uncertainty temporarily captured their attention. Real relationships are sustained by honesty, consistency, trust, and mutual effort, not by emotional confusion or wounded pride. In the end, nothing unsettles unhealthy patterns more than someone who quietly refuses to participate in them. When you stop measuring your worth by another person's inconsistency, you gain something far more valuable than their attention. You gain emotional freedom, and that is the foundation upon which every healthy relationship is built. Avoidant individuals often appear emotionally unaffected, but beneath that calm exterior, many are protecting a deep need to feel emotionally safe and in control. What they often fear is not simply losing a relationship, it is losing the certainty that the relationship will remain available on familiar terms. As long as they believe someone will continue waiting, reaching out, or carrying the emotional weight of the connection, they may feel comfortable maintaining distance. But when that familiar pattern quietly changes, their attention often shifts as well. They begin noticing things they previously overlooked. They may wonder why your energy feels different, why you seem calmer, more focused on your own life, or less emotionally dependent on their responses. Stay with me, because this quiet transformation explains far more than dramatic confrontations ever could. Growth changes the emotional landscape in ways that arguments rarely achieve. When you stop measuring your peace by another person's consistency, you naturally become more grounded. You continue living your life, pursuing your goals, strengthening your relationships, and investing in your own well-being. That quiet confidence is difficult to ignore because it reflects genuine emotional independence. Someone who once expected you to revolve around their rhythm may suddenly notice that you have created a rhythm of your own. Instead of waiting for their attention, you are building a life that feels meaningful regardless of what they choose. That shift often encourages reflection because familiar assumptions no longer fit reality. They may begin looking back at previous conversations, comparing the person you once were with the person you have become. They notice that your reactions have changed. You are calmer, less reactive, more selective with your time and emotional energy. This difference is not created by emotional games. It is created by personal growth. And genuine growth has a way of quietly challenging old expectations without saying a single word. The greatest transformation is not convincing someone to value you. It is reaching the point where your own value no longer depends on whether they do. Many avoidant people become comfortable in relationships where the other person continually compensates for emotional distance. They may unconsciously expect others to initiate conversations, repair misunderstandings, offer reassurance, or maintain the connection whenever tension appears. When those patterns continue, they rarely have to examine their own role in the relationship. But everything changes when they encounter someone who quietly steps outside that familiar cycle. Instead of chasing closeness, that person chooses self-respect. Instead of reacting with anxiety, they respond with calmness. Instead of making another person's emotional inconsistency the center of their world, they continue growing into a stronger version of themselves. This shift creates something unfamiliar. The avoidant individual may begin wondering where they stand because the old emotional script is no longer unfolding. They may notice that the person they once expected to remain available is no longer organizing life around the relationship. Rather than creating panic through confrontation, healthy independence creates curiosity through contrast. It quietly demonstrates that emotional stability does not require constant reassurance from another person. This does not mean the avoidant person suddenly falls in love or becomes emotionally healthy overnight. Real change still requires personal responsibility, self-awareness, and willingness to grow. But your transformation can become a mirror that gently reflects what has changed. Instead of showing someone how much you need them, it shows them how complete you can become without depending on their approval. That kind of confidence often leaves a much deeper impression than emotional pursuit because it cannot be dismissed as temporary emotion. It reflects a lasting shift in identity. Keep listening, because this final principle brings everything together. The healthiest relationships are never built on making another person fear losing you. They are built when two emotionally mature people freely choose each other from a place of honesty, consistency, and mutual respect. The real goal is not becoming unforgettable to someone who struggles with closeness. The real goal is becoming so emotionally secure that you no longer need unhealthy dynamics to feel valuable. When you stop seeking validation from someone who cannot consistently provide it, you create room for healthier relationships to enter your life. You continue healing, learning, developing meaningful goals, and building a future that reflects your values rather than your fears. If someone eventually recognizes your worth, let it happen because they have done their own inner work, not because uncertainty temporarily captured their attention. Lasting love cannot be sustained through wounded pride, emotional confusion, or shifting power dynamics. It grows through trust, accountability, vulnerability, and consistent effort from both people. In the end, the most attractive quality is not emotional mystery. It is emotional stability. It is knowing your worth without needing someone else to confirm it. It is having the courage to walk away from patterns that no longer serve your well-being while remaining open to relationships that are built on genuine partnership instead of emotional imbalance. That is where real peace begins. And from that place of peace, every future connection has the opportunity to become healthier, stronger, and more authentic than anything built on uncertainty ever could. And that is exactly what makes you impossible to forget. People with avoidant patterns often struggle to understand someone who no longer plays the emotional role they quietly depended on. The moment you stop searching for their attention, you stop feeding the silent sense of control that once made them feel secure. The moment you stop needing their approval, they begin losing the influence they never admitted they had. When you no longer react to their emotional distance, they no longer know how to shape the connection the way they once did. And when you finally choose to walk away with quiet confidence, not to punish them, not to make them jealous, but because you have genuinely outgrown the situation, everything changes. You become the memory that refuses to disappear. Stay with me, because this is where most people completely misunderstand what really happens. They rarely spend years thinking about the people who stayed available. Instead, their minds often return to the people who truly moved on. You become the unanswered question, the unfinished chapter, the quiet what if that appears in the middle of the night when distractions disappear and emotional defenses become weaker. They begin asking themselves when you became strong enough to leave without looking back. They notice the confidence you slowly built. They recognize the self-respect you finally embraced. They start realizing that you may have been the most emotionally dependable person they ever experienced. Yet they pushed you away because consistency felt unfamiliar and even uncomfortable. That realization can weigh far more heavily than heartbreak itself. You become the person who slipped away, not because you were lacking, but because you finally understood your own worth. You walked away without demanding closure, without chasing validation, without waiting for them to become someone different. And that is the moment they begin seeing you with complete clarity. It is uncomfortable. It is undeniable. It is something they cannot easily erase. They rarely become attached to the person who endlessly chased them. Instead, they often remember the one they could never truly keep. The one who recognized the emotional patterns without becoming trapped inside them. The one who chose personal peace over emotional confusion. You become the loss that quietly follows them long after the relationship has ended. The person they compare others to without realizing it. The memory they replay instead of releasing. The one who escaped the cycle. And by choosing yourself, you became unforgettable. Here is the truth that surprises almost everyone. You do not make someone emotionally fixated by loving them more intensely. You create the greatest impact by loving yourself more deeply. People with avoidant habits rarely respond to pressure. They rarely respond to pursuit. They rarely respond to someone who constantly bends, shrinks, or sacrifices emotional needs just to keep the relationship alive. In many cases, that only strengthens their belief that they hold all the emotional power, and that belief allows them to stay distant. But everything shifts when your life begins expanding, not because you are trying to impress them, not because you want their attention back, simply because you finally decide that your own growth matters. You stop trying to pull them toward you and begin standing firmly within your own life. That quiet shift carries more influence than endless conversations ever could. Keep watching, because the next part explains why this change feels so powerful. The answer is surprisingly simple. They become deeply affected when your world no longer revolves around them. When loving yourself becomes natural instead of performative, your energy changes in ways that cannot be copied or forced. You create a completely different emotional presence, one they never expected and cannot easily ignore. Suddenly, the entire connection begins to reverse. Instead of you chasing emotional availability, they start noticing that you no longer depend on theirs. Instead of making yourself smaller to fit inside their comfort zone, you continue growing in a direction they cannot follow unless they are willing to grow as well. Very few experiences challenge an emotionally avoidant person more than watching someone they once believed they understood become someone they can no longer define. As you continue rising, their certainty begins falling apart. Your confidence reminds them of the version of you they underestimated. Your emotional strength highlights the limitations of their avoidance. Your independence becomes undeniable proof that they were never as irreplaceable as they once believed. Inside them, reality begins colliding with ego, and that internal conflict is often where deep emotional fixation quietly begins. Not because you are trying to prove a point, not because you want revenge, simply because your growth forces them to face a truth they spent a long time avoiding. They lost access to the version of you that accepted emotional distance without question, and now they see someone who no longer needs outside validation to feel complete. That is when your silence begins carrying more weight than your words ever did. Even from a distance, your presence feels stronger. Your absence becomes louder than all the affection you once gave so freely. They begin noticing the version of you that stopped explaining, stopped waiting, stopped hoping, and stopped making them the center of every emotional decision. That realization changes everything, because they finally understand something they never expected.